He is a legend in sports broadcasting. For years, the host of the Olympic Games, the World Series, the Kentucky Derby, and roles in bringing us virtually every major sport. He also helmed the shows Later with Bob Costas on NBC and HBO's On the Record with Bob Costas. He was the host of Sunday Night Football and is a regular on the MLB Network. One of the great interviewers of our era and one of the most intelligent and respected gentlemen in the history of TV sportscasting. Please welcome Bob Costas.
Bob. Hello, Bob.
Someone comes all the way up from Port-au-Prince, and I somehow, with some lame excuse or another, wind up in Jane Pauley's townhouse, and soon enough you'll see Jane, oddly enough, sitting on the very same sofa and communicating with you. So my apologies, A, for not being there in person, although perhaps that's a relief to some in the audience because I'm not universally embraced anymore, because now and then I've been known to speak out on an issue or two, and you find out that if you step out of line, sometimes people, resent it a little bit. But I apologize to anyone who actually was coming, at least in part, to see me. And as you and I discussed, not only will I make a donation of my own to the literacy programs in Detroit, especially to the orphanage that you run in Haiti, and at my very next opportunity to be in Detroit, you'll help me arrange it. And anybody that was going to be part of the smaller gathering, we won't have to wait for the Tigers to get to the World Series. It can just be a Tiger game.
And thank God for that. Yes.
That they play in 2019. I'll be there and try and make amends. So
yes. We appreciate that, Bob. Yeah, Bob had an emergency that had to be dealt with in New York at the last minute and wasn't able to fly out. He was all set to come, but he was gracious enough to find his way to a camera and do the show anyhow. And he said to me when we spoke very, very late last night, he said, if there are people who came specifically to meet him, please get their names and whatever. And when he comes back to Detroit, we'll invite them for a private thing. So it's probably going to need to be a big room, but we'll make sure that we do that, and we'll give you the methodology to do it. Meanwhile, Bob, we want to thank you for joining us here tonight. And I forgot your hairstyles over the years. We just watched your entire career. Forgot you used to have the Bobby Sherman haircut going there for a while.
You had one shot from about 1980 or 81 when I first started with NBC, and I was 27 when I started at the network. And Don Ohlmeyer, who then ran NBC Sports and is a legendary figure, the Olympics with Roone Arledge, the beginning of Monday Night Football with Howard Cosell, and he was a very charismatic man who kind of filled up a room. And he called me into his office after I'd been there for a couple of months, and he said, you're a promising young man. We think you have a future here. Let me ask you something. How old are you? And I said, I'm 27. And he said, damn it, you look like you're 14. And he said, how much older do you think you would look if you grew a beard? And he was serious. This was like his brainstorm. And I said, 5 years at least. And he perked up. He said, 5 years, really? I said, yeah, because that's how long it would take to grow it. So, it was what it was. It is what it is.
I don't think in your entire career you have ever been anything but clean shaven. Am I right? You've never had a mustache on the air or anything like that,
no,
right?
not on the air. In 2000 in Sydney, I got there about 3 weeks before the Olympic Games started, and I was touring the whole country and the Outback and Melbourne and Brisbane and all over the place, the Great Barrier Reef, and I didn't shave for, I think, 12 days. And it didn't work for me like the way it worked for Don Johnson on Miami Vice.
Yeah.
There were little patches, and it started to get itchy, and I wasn't going to keep it for the games anyway, but that was as far as I could go, about 2 weeks.
Now, did you always, I know that you began close to our heart here in Detroit. Your first broadcasting, I think, for anything official was a hockey team in Syracuse, wasn't it? Didn't you start in the hockey world?
Yeah, I was a senior at Syracuse University, and I got a job broadcasting minor league hockey in the old Eastern Hockey League, which is the actual league that the Paul Newman movie Slapshot, which was made only a few years later, is based on. And in fact, I knew some of the players who were extras in the movie. And for this fine job, I got $30 a game and $5 a day meal money on the road, which I would have paid them if I had $30 in my wallet, but I didn't. I was a 21-year-old kid at Syracuse. And I faked my way through a year of broadcasting hockey, and then was lucky enough to wind up going to KMOX in St. Louis to do pro basketball, and then briefly at CBS TV before BBC noticed me, and then I wound up there.
Is there any event, because I know you've done the Olympics, you do the Kentucky Derby, you've done baseball, you've done basketball, you did ABA basketball, you've done football. Is there any one at this stage and age that has somehow eluded you? Like somehow, for some reason, you've never broadcast this particular sport or this particular event that you could check off on a bucket list?
You know, the only one I could think of really would be the Masters, and I'm not really a golf guy. I've done the Ryder Cup at the U.S. Open when NBC had it in kind of I'll set the scene host role, but not an expert's role. So there would be no particular reason for me to be involved in the Masters, but I think there's a certain prestige and a certain history involved where you'd like to be able to say that you could check that one off. But apart from that, I've been lucky enough to do just about anything that I ever dreamt to do.
Yeah. Bob and I have known each other a long time, and over the years, we've commiserated a little bit about the nature of sports broadcasting and sports writing and the nature of media in general, in how mean it has gotten and how loud it has gotten. And, I was proud to be part of a show called The Sports Reporters on ESPN for 25 years. And for 25 years, thank you. For 25 years, we never yelled at each other. We always wore suits and ties, and it was just understood that the discussion, however passionate, was supposed to be civil. And now it seems like if you're civil, you're canceled because nobody wants to watch civil, everybody wants to watch screaming. How have you sort of dealt with that in your world, Bob, and what are your thoughts on that?
Well, luckily enough for me, I was kind of grandfathered in before it took the nasty turn that it's taken, not just in sports, but more significantly in politics and in our whole civil discourse. By then, my positions were kind of secured at NBC, and I also saw the light at the end of the tunnel. I let them know a few years ago that I intended to leave after the 2016 Olympics in Rio and following that football season, and then take on kind of an emeritus role where I'd pop up now and then. So I was able to avoid ever having to do that just to sustain my career, and I don't think I would have been willing to do it. I think there's a very significant difference between irreverence and a willingness to be outspoken and just snarkiness and mean-spiritedness and ad hominem attacks. We could go on about this. Entire books have been written about it already, and it's only gotten worse. It's gotten worse in the 5 minutes that we've been speaking. It gets worse every single day, where everything is true and nothing is true, depending upon what you want to be true. There is some silo out there on the internet or on cable TV that will tell you exactly, some bubble you can enter, that will tell you what you want to hear and only what you want to hear. And if a choir of angels, the entire faculty at Oxford, presents contradictory evidence, you don't have to believe that because you've been told by somebody that that's fake news. You don't have to believe anything you don't want to believe, no matter how overwhelming the evidence, and you can embrace anything you want to embrace, no matter how scant or even non-existent the evidence is. And you and I had this conversation once before, where we decided the best that we could do, and luckily we've been around long enough to have our own patch of ground. I don't know that we can turn this Leviathan around, but we can hold our own little patch of territory and try to be true to it.
Yeah. Well, I admire the way you've been holding yours. We've been talking here about how people affect one another, and the 5 people you meet in heaven was based on an old uncle of mine who his name was Eddie, and he was a World War II vet, and he was really strong, and one of these guys talked like this and used to wear beater T-shirts, but he would tuck them in for dinner for formal wear, and he used to say that he was a nobody and a nothing, but he also told me that he died one night on an operating table when they were doing open heart surgery, one of those cases where they lost him for a few seconds. And he said that he remembered lifting out of his body and rising and looking down on his body being operated on. And he said he saw all of his dead relatives waiting for him at the edge of the bed. So, of course, as kids, you say, well, good, what'd you do? What'd you do? And, being the salty guy that he was, he said, what'd I do? I told him, get the hell out of here. I'm not ready for any use yet. And apparently he scared them right back to heaven, and he went back into his body, and he lived a little longer. But from that moment on, that's what I thought heaven was, because he was my uncle, and he wasn't going to lie to me. And so I always had this notion that people are waiting for you. And in the books, the 5 people you meet in heaven and the next person you meet in heaven, they are waiting for you, but they're not necessarily your relatives. Maybe some of them are, but some of them may just be total strangers that you had like 5 minutes with, and they changed your life forever. I want to ask you, Bob, was there ever anyone in your life that, not necessarily a mother or a father or whatever, but an individual person that altered your path and inexorably changed your life forever?
When you first presented that premise to me, so many names went through my mind. People who were helpful, people who gave me good advice, people who saw something in me before I was established and gave me a break. And we can all cite those people who opened doors for us. I'm going to give you an answer that might be a little bit more difficult to quantify. And at first it seems like a cliche, because the answer is my father, but it's not necessarily in a Norman Rockwell way. In his best moments, my dad was a Damon Runyon type character, but he never was the dad around the Thanksgiving dinner table that Norman Rockwell would have idealized. My dad was an inveterate gambler and a colorful character, and it was because he gambled on games. He didn't go to the racetrack, he gambled on baseball games. And there was no internet, there was no ESPN, there wasn't even sports phone. So you could only get the games that you could pick up on Long Island. Mets, the Yankees, the Knicks, whatever it might be. And sometimes he would send me, when I was 10, 11 years old, he'd send me out to the driveway with the keys to the car, because you could get radio reception better sometimes at night outside than inside. And he'd have me looking for Ernie Harwell on WJR in Detroit through the crackle and static, or Harry Carey on KMOX in St. Louis, to try to pick up the score of a game that he had a bet on. And when the mortgage is riding on whether Whitey Ford could get Al Kaline, it can create a lot of anxiety within a family. And it really, I think it scarred my mother, my sister, and myself in different ways. But oddly enough, I became fascinated with the voices of these games. So instead of turning my back on that which had created so much emotional turmoil for my family, for some reason it brought me closer to my father, even in difficult times, because I was the reporter. That was my first reporting job, to run back in the house and let him know how his games were going. And he had, although he could be endearing and charming and funny, he had a terribly volatile temper, an awfully volatile temper. He wasn't physically abusive, but he was emotionally abusive. And he passed away when I was 18, about to graduate from high school and go to Syracuse. He never saw anything I ever did professionally. I often would be sitting in a broadcast booth somewhere wondering if my father, had he been alive, would have been calling me to find out who was injured or who was out late the night before, or something to influence his bet in some way, but he never got to see that part of my life. But what I came to terms with, and I don't think I was conscious of it at the time, but in retrospect, I realized that if I was going to love my father and love the memory of my father, then I would have to take the view that you could love people who were far from perfect, and that you could see the best in people, not in a naive way, not to exclude the harsher realities. So I remember the Christmases that were ruined because bets went the wrong way. I remember the times when guys, no joke, named Three Finger and Fury came to the door to collect. He didn't have the money to pay, and having to go to relatives and ask to borrow On the other hand, I remember going to a donut shop in Brooklyn with him once and having the bookmaker slide a paper bag across the counter of the donut shop. And then my father casually took the paper bag and under a street light sat in the car and he counted out $14,000 in $100 bills in 1966, which was almost as much as what our house cost. So I was torn between not knowing when the next eruption of temper and volatility and heartache would come, but also the fact that my father was more glamorous and interesting than the guy who lived next door and mowed his lawn every Saturday. And so I had to come to terms with that, and I had to embrace and remember the worthwhile times, and remember things like the first time he took me to Yankee Stadium in 1959. I was 7 years old, and they used to let you leave the old Yankee Stadium, the wedding cake, triple-deck facade, and the monuments actually on the field, center field in front of the flagpole, because it was 461 feet to straightaway center field. And at that time, there were only 3 monuments, Gehrig, Ruth, and their manager, Miller Huggins. And I'm 7 years old, and we walk around the warning track, and we get to the monuments. And what would any 7-year-old think, other than the fact that Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig were buried there, that they were buried underneath the warning track, and that those were their tombstones.
Right.
And worse yet, when Mickey Mantle died, they buried him there too. And it was just too much for 7-year-old me, and I began to cry. And my father, I remember he wasn't always tender. He was often volatile and sometimes hurtful. And I remember him picking me up and kind of shaking me and making me laugh. And I remember he was wearing a yellow polo shirt. And unlike his son, who's a rather slight man, he was a muscular, like 5'11", 190 guy, looked like an athlete. He's wearing this short-sleeved yellow polo shirt. And he smelled like all men of that era smelled. He smelled like Old Spice.
Yeah.
And they say that the sense of smell stays with you longer than almost any other memory. And I can still remember him hoisting me up on his shoulders and the smell of that Old Spice and looking around the awesome Yankee Stadium and him walking me out the street, getting me to laugh and tears stopping. And if I wasn't able to believe in that, I could never have reconciled my relationship with my father. And I think that that had an effect on how I viewed other people. I'm not naive, and journalistically you have to at least be skeptical, which is different than being cynical. But I try to give people the benefit of the doubt, both personally and professionally. I try to see what's good in them, even if I have to confront what is lacking or is objectionable about them. And I hope that that adds up to fairness, so that indirectly, what I had to do to come to terms with something that was important to me personally, I think had an effect on the type of person I became professionally.
Well, that's a fantastic answer. Yeah. And I can't think of a better way to end a conversation on a night like this than to say that looking for the best in someone, even when it's a little bit hidden, is a good trait, a noble trait, and a human trait that we probably ought to be doing a little more of than we're doing now. So, yeah. Bob, on behalf of everybody here, thank you very, very much for that message, and thank you for joining us. Bob Costas, folks.
Thank you, Mitch. Look forward to seeing you in person sometime soon. Thanks.
Thank you.